Nobody in that field thought a 12-year-old girl was going to be a problem. That was their first mistake. Their second was holding the auction at all, but we'll get to that. Let me start with a notebook. Marlowe Bancroft had been keeping what she called a record book since she was 9 years old. A yellow composition notebook, the ordinary kind you find in any dollar store, in any small town in the South, with the black and white marbled cover and the college-ruled pages that she filled with the patient, deliberate handwriting of a girl who had decided that the world was worth documenting. She wasn't keeping it for school. She was keeping it because of something she'd read one winter afternoon in the Cartersville Public Library, sitting cross-legged on the floor between the biography shelves, a book about writers open on her lap. The book said that the good ones wrote things down, that the act of noticing and recording was its own discipline, that you saw more when you committed to seeing and then committed to paper what you'd seen. Marlowe was 9. She had no reason to doubt this. Children that age haven't yet learned the particular adult habit of second-guessing their own instincts, of talking themselves out of the truths they recognize immediately. She recognized this one. She decided with the absolute unquestioning certainty that belongs only to children that this was the kind of person she wanted to be. Mrs. Blythe, the librarian, a woman with silver hair and the unhurried patience of someone who had spent her life among books, had noticed the girl sitting there for 3 hours. She walked over and asked what she was reading. Marlowe held the book up. "This book says, if you write everything down, you see more. Do you think that's true?" Mrs. Blythe looked at her for a moment. "I think there's only one way to find out." The next day, Marlowe bought her first composition notebook from the dollar store on Main Street. She wrote her name on the inside cover and the date and nothing else because she hadn't yet decided what was worth recording. By the end of that week, she had decided everything. Everything was worth recording because you couldn't know in advance which observation would matter and which wouldn't, and the ones you didn't write down were the ones you lost. She had been keeping the record book ever since. She brought it everywhere, including the Bancroft Farm auction on the 23rd of July. And what happened at that auction on a blazing Tuesday morning in the red clay hill country east of Rome, Georgia, under a white canvas tent in a field that Grandpa Emmett had cut and baled every summer for 40 years, is what this story is about. Emmett Bancroft's farm stretched across 175 acres of northwestern Georgia hill country. The land was the particular kind of Georgia terrain that people who don't know the state sometimes miss entirely. Not the flat coastal plain to the south, not the mountain country to the north, but the middle ground, the red clay hills where the peach trees grow in long, fragrant rows, and the soil runs dark and rich beneath the rust-colored surface, and the summers press down with a humid, encompassing heat that makes the whole world feel like it's growing whether it wants to or not. Emmett had started with 80 acres in a peach orchard he'd inherited from his uncle, a man named Orrin Bancroft, who had planted the first trees in the late 1950s. Orrin had possessed the particular agricultural patience of a man willing to wait 4 years for a tree to bear fruit, knowing that he might not live to see the 10th harvest, and planting anyway. Orrin had planted, and Emmett had inherited, and Emmett had expanded. Hay ground added to the South in 1981, the first piece of land he'd bought with money he earned himself. Timber Ridge on the north boundary, purchased from a neighbor retiring in 1994. The original orchard replanted and expanded in the early 2000s when the old rootstock began to decline. By the time this story arrives at its crisis, Emmett's farm grew 6 varieties of peaches, baled 300 to 400 round bales of coastal Bermuda hay annually, and was the kind of operation that made enough to sustain itself in good years and enough to survive barely in bad ones. Emmett was 74 years old. He had the hands of a man who had worked outdoors since he was 14. calloused, strong, mapped with the small scars that accumulate over 60 years of farm work. He was not a large man physically, but he had the quality of presence that belongs to people who have stood in difficult weather for long enough that difficult weather no longer impresses them. He expressed admiration through the quality of his attention rather than the volume of his praise. When he watched you work, you knew he was watching, and that was enough. He was Marlowe's favorite person on earth. She had been spending summers on his farm since she was 4 years old. 6 weeks every July and August, when her mother Emmett's daughter Waverly drove her from their home in Cartersville to the farm and left her there with the particular mixture of relief and gratitude that parents feel when a grandparent takes a child for a summer and does it with genuine joy. Marlowe arrived every summer with a new composition notebook and left every summer with it filled. And Emmett had never once asked what she wrote in them, which was one of the many reasons she loved him. He trusted her to know what was worth recording. The operating note had come about 4 years earlier. Emmett had borrowed $41,000 from Blue Valley Agricultural Credit, a regional agricultural lender with offices in Rome, to fund an equipment upgrade and orchard replanting. The peach trees on the oldest block of the orchard had reached the end of their productive life. They needed to come out and be replaced, which is a significant cost on a peach farm. The removal, the soil preparation, the new trees, and the 4-year gap before the replacement trees bear a commercial crop, 4 years of expense with no corresponding income from that block. It was a reasonable loan for a reasonable agricultural purpose. The loan officer who processed it was a man named Rowan Gentry. He was pleasant, organized, and efficient in the way that people are pleasant and organized and efficient when they want something from you and haven't gotten it yet. He had shaken Emmett's hand across the desk and explained the terms and told Emmett that Blue Valley valued long-term relationships with farm operations like his. Emmett had brought his neighbor and longtime friend Corbin Whitfield with him to the signing. Corbin was about 70, a man who had farmed the adjacent property for 30 years and who had paid off his own farm debt long ago. Corbin was cautious by nature, a man who read every page of every document placed in front of him, slowly, carefully, as if the words might rearrange themselves if he looked away. Corbin found something on the 4th page. He put his finger on a clause and read it aloud right there in the office in front of Rowan Gentry. The clause said that the bank reserved the right to accelerate collection of the full outstanding balance if the value of the collateral, meaning the farm, declined substantially. Emmett, Corbin said, this means if the farm loses value for any reason, crop loss, bad market, anything at all, they can call the whole loan due immediately, not just the missed payment, the whole thing. Emmett looked at Rowan Gentry. Rowan smiled, not a large smile, a careful, professional, reassuring smile. That's standard language, Mr. Whitfield. Boilerplate. Every agricultural note in the state has it. We never enforce it against good customers with strong operations. Emmett signed. He trusted Rowan Gentry the way people in small agricultural communities trust the man at the bank who shakes their hand and calls them by their first name and says words like long-term relationship and partnership. On the drive home in the cab of Corbin's truck with the signed documents in a manila envelope on the seat between them, Corbin said one thing. I don't like that man's smile, Emmett. Emmett didn't answer. The truck rolled on through the red clay hills and neither man said anything else, and the afternoon sun pressed down through the windshield with the heavy, indifferent heat of a Georgia summer. 2 years passed. The replacement trees grew. The hay operation was stable. The operating note payments were made on time, everyone, for 24 straight months. Then came the frost. A late frost in April of the 3rd year. The kind that arrives after 2 weeks of warm weather, when the trees have already bloomed and the fruit has already set, the kind that every peach farmer in Georgia knows about and fears and cannot prevent. It killed 70% of the young peach crop on the bearing trees at the worst possible moment, 2 weeks before harvest, when the fruit was nearly full size and the income from it was already penciled into Emmett's operating budget. The loss was catastrophic. Emmett missed a payment. Then working through the summer and fall hay income, he partially caught up, then missed another. Rowan Gentry called. The call was pleasant in the way that calls are pleasant when the person making them has already decided what the outcome is going to be and is simply observing the procedural requirements before implementing it. He had spoken about the note's terms, about the default provisions, about Blue Valley's obligation to protect its collateral. Then Rowan said something that stopped Emmett cold. "Mr. Bancroft, I want to be straightforward with you. We have a party interested in purchasing a portion of your property, the South Hay Ground, 40 acres. It would allow you to pay down the note significantly and keep the rest of the operation intact." Emmett's hand tightened on the phone. The South Hay Ground, the first 40 acres he'd ever bought with his own money in 1981, before Waverly was born, before Marlowe existed, when he was a young man with a new wife and a belief that hard work and good land would be enough. "Who's interested?" Emmett asked. "A local investment group. I can't share details at this stage, but they're serious buyers, fair offer." "I'm not selling the South Ground, Mr. Gentry." A pause on the line. When Rowan spoke again, his voice was the same pleasant tone, but something underneath it had shifted the way the temperature drops just before a storm rolls in, and you can feel it on your skin before you see the clouds. "I understand, Mr. Bancroft, but I want to be direct with you. If we can't find a resolution, the bank's only remaining option is a lender's auction. And at auction, you could lose everything, not just 40 acres. The word everything hung in the air after Rowan said it. Emmett stood in his kitchen with the phone against his ear and looked out the window at the peach rows, the hay ground, the timber ridge, the barn, all of it, 175 acres of a man's whole working life, and heard the word everything settle over it like frost. "I've paid you people on time for 2 years before the frost," Emmett said. "One bad year and you want to take my farm." "Nobody wants to take anything, Mr. Bancroft. I'm trying to help you keep what you can." Emmett hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. He did not know, standing there, how specifically the auction option had already been arranged. Marlowe had been on the farm for 3 weeks when the letter arrived. She was 12 now. This was her 9th summer on the farm, and she had filled 7.5 composition notebooks over those 9 years. She was sitting on the porch, her record book open on her lap, writing about the way the morning light hit the peach rows at 7:15 when Emmett walked up from the mailbox with a single white envelope. She watched him read it. She was good at watching people read things. She had noticed over 9 summers that Emmett's face when he read bad news went through a specific sequence. The slight tightening around the eyes first, then the jaw, then the careful, deliberate rereading of the line that had caused the tightening, as if reading it again might produce a different meaning. He read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and set it on the kitchen table, and stood there with both hands flat on the surface, the way a man stands when he is holding something down. "Grandpa," Marlowe said from the porch doorway. He looked at her. His face had the quality of a man who has decided not to show a thing and knows the person he's talking to can see the decision being made. "Bank business," he said. "Adult stuff." "I know," Marlowe said, "but I saw your face." Emmett looked at her for a moment with the expression he sometimes got when she said something more accurate than he had expected. Then he told her the truth, because lying to Marlowe had never served any purpose. She would simply watch you until the lie became obvious, and then she would wait, and the waiting was worse than anything she might have said. "Auction notice," he said, "and they're saying the note's in default, and they're holding an auction to recover the debt. 3 weeks. The auction firm is called Ridgeline Auction Group. The auctioneer's name is Reed Prescott." Marlowe opened her record book. She wrote daytime auction notice, Ridgeline Auction Group, Reed Prescott. Can I come? She said. Emmett looked at the notebook. He looked at his granddaughter. He was quiet. It's not going to be pleasant, he said. I know. Can I come? Waverly was in the kitchen. She had heard. She came to the porch door with her arms crossed and her face set. Absolutely not. You're 12 years old, Marlowe. This is not a field trip. Marlowe looked at her mother. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She held the record book open on her lap and looked at Waverly with a patient, steady expression that Waverly recognized instantly because it was Emmett's expression. The same quiet, immovable attention. The same refusal to perform emotion as a way of winning an argument. Waverly looked at her father. Dad, tell her she can't come. Emmett was silent for a long moment. He looked at his daughter, and then he looked at his granddaughter, and then he looked out at the farm, the porch railing, the peach rows in the morning light, the barn. She'd been sitting on that porch every summer since she was 4, Emmett said. She's not a visitor here, Waverly. She lives here. Waverly opened her mouth, then closed it. She knew that tone. When Emmett used it, the decision was made. She turned and went back into the kitchen, and the screen door closed behind her with the particular quiet slam of a woman who disagrees and has chosen not to fight about it and will remember that she disagreed. Marlowe wrote in her notebook, auction 3 weeks. In the 3 weeks between the letter and the auction, Marlowe paid attention. This was not unusual for her. She paid attention the way other people breathed as a continuous and involuntary act. But she focused it now in the way that a magnifying glass focuses light when you angle it correctly. She focused it on the auction. She had looked up how farm auctions worked on the school tablet she'd brought for the summer. She read about lenders' auctions, about foreclosure proceedings, about how auctioneers were licensed in the state of Georgia, and what the rules were. She found the Georgia Secretary of State's business registry online and looked up Ridgeline Auction Group, the auction firm named in the letter. The registered agent for Ridgeline Auction Group was Reed Prescott. She wrote his name in the record book. She searched for Reed Prescott in the Georgia Business Registry and found 3 registered business entities attached to his name. One of them was a company called Copper Ridge Partners, LLC. She wrote that down too. She didn't know yet what it meant. She wrote it because she had trained herself to write things she noticed even before she understood why she was noticing them, on the theory, which had served her well across years of notebooks, that the significance of an observation often became clear only in retrospect, and that the observations you didn't write down were the ones you lost. Wyatt Fairchild showed up at the farm during the 2nd week. He was 14, a quiet boy with rough hands and the contained, simmering anger of a teenager who has already seen adults fail. He did seasonal work for Emmett, hauling hay bales, mending fence line, hard physical labor that farm kids learn young. His father, Hollis Fairchild, had lost a 90-acre farm the year before. Wyatt didn't talk about it much. But one afternoon, sitting in the shade of a peach tree during their lunch break, he said something to Marlowe that she wrote down. Mr. Emmett's a good man, but when they decide to take the land, nobody stops them. My dad thought he'd keep ours too, went to meetings, talked to the bank, had friends helping, lost it anyway. Marlowe looked at him. Who bought your dad's farm? Wyatt shrugged. Some company. Dad won't talk about it. Do you remember the name? He shook his head. Then he looked at her, at the 12-year-old girl holding a composition notebook in a peach orchard, and said, What are you going to do? Write it down and make it go away. Marlowe didn't answer. She wrote the conversation in her record book. She underlined the question, who bought the Fairchild farm? That Saturday, Marlowe went with Emmett to the Rome Farmers Market. Lennox Ogletree ran the peach stand there and had been selling Emmett's peaches and produce from several other local farms for over 20 years. She was 60 years old, blunt-spoken with the direct gaze and firm handshake of a woman who had survived on slim margins her whole life and had no patience left for nonsense. When Emmett walked away to fill a water jug, Lennox pulled Marlowe aside. She crouched down slightly to meet the girl's eyes and spoke in a low voice, the way people speak when they're sharing something they've been carrying alone for too long. You know the Fairchild place lost it last year. Before that, the Birch Farm out west of Rome 2 years back. Both went to auction. Both had the same auction company. Marlowe felt something shift in her chest, a tightening, like the first click of a lock opening. Ridgeline Auction Group, she said. Lennox stared at her. The girl was 12. She knew the name. Where'd you hear that name? Grandpa's letter. Lennox was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, and you know who bought both those farms? No, same group. I don't remember the name exactly, but same people, both times. Marlowe wrote everything down. That evening, back at the farm, she sat on her bed with the tablet and searched for public land transfer records in the county. She found the Birch Farm. The buyer was listed in the deed transfer filing. Copper Ridge Partners, LLC. She looked at her record book. She had written that name 2 weeks earlier when she'd searched for Reed Prescott in the business registry and found it among his 3 registered entities. Now it appeared again on the other side of a transaction as the buyer of a farm that went to auction through Ridgeline Auction Group. Same auction company, same buyer, different farm. She searched for the Fairchild Farm transfer. The county records took longer to navigate, and she couldn't find the specific deed filing before the tablet's battery died. But Lennox had said same people, and the Birch Farm confirmed it. Copper Ridge Partners, LLC, was connected to Reed Prescott. Reed Prescott was the auctioneer, and his company was buying the farms he auctioned. Marlowe sat on the bed in the dark, the dead tablet beside her, the composition notebook open in her lap, and the flashlight from the nightstand shining down on the page. She drew 3 lines, 3 arrows. Ridgeline Auction Group arrow, Copper Ridge Partners, LLC arrow, Birch Farm. Ridgeline Auction Group arrow, Copper Ridge Partners, LLC arrow. Fairchild Farm ? Ridgeline Auction Group, arrow ? Arrow. Emmett's Farm. 3 farms, the same path. She wrote beneath the arrows, it's a pattern. Then below that in smaller letters, but I need proof, not a pattern. That was the moment she crossed from noticing into something else. Not investigation exactly. She was 12. She didn't think of it in those terms. But she understood sitting there in the dark with the flashlight and the notebook that seeing something was not the same as proving it, and that the distance between those 2 things was where it mattered. She had trained herself to see. Now she needed to show someone else what she'd seen in a way they couldn't look away from. She closed the notebook. She turned off the flashlight. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of her mother and Emmett talking on the porch below her window, their voices low and careful in the summer night. Waverly had arrived that evening. She told Emmett she had found a lawyer, Tessa Stanhope, a real property attorney in Rome who had agreed to be available by phone during the auction at a rate Waverly had charged to the credit card she carried for emergencies. Emmett's response came slowly, the way his responses always came when he was feeling something he didn't want to show. I don't want more people seeing this, Waverly. Half the county's already going to be standing in my field watching a stranger sell off my equipment. This isn't about embarrassment, Dad. This is about keeping the farm. A long silence. Crickets in the hayfield. The creak of the porch swing. Your mother would have told me to handle it quiet. Waverly's voice trembled, but held. Mom would have told you to let the people who love you help. Emmett didn't agree in words. He stood up from the porch swing, walked inside, set his coffee cup in the kitchen sink with a quiet, deliberate click. And that, with Emmett, was how he said yes. Upstairs, Marlowe lay awake. She had heard everything through the open window. She took out her record book and wrote by flashlight, the beam making a small circle of yellow on the page. Grandpa doesn't want help. Mom is scared. I'm scared too. But I found something. I don't know if it's enough yet. She stared at that last line. The word yet sat there on the ruled paper like a small, stubborn promise. She closed the notebook. She put it under her pillow. She lay in the dark and listened to the crickets and the distant sound of Emmett's boots on the kitchen floor, the slow, deliberate steps of a man walking through a house he built and wondering if he'll still be walking through it next month. In the morning, Marlowe awoke before anyone else. She sat on the porch with her record book and watched the peach rose in the early light. The fruit hung heavy on the branches 2 weeks from harvest, fragrant in the still morning air, the particular sweet living smell of peaches that are almost ready. She wrote the date, the time, the temperature estimated from the feel of the air on her arms, the smell of the peaches, the sound of the first birds. Then she wrote 2 words, auction day. She closed the notebook. She stood up from the porch swing. She walked to the corner of the porch where her red folding chair leaned against the railing, the chair she'd brought from the house every morning for 9 summers to sit in the yard, the orchard, the hayfield, wherever the work was happening. She picked it up and tucked it under her arm. She was ready. The morning of the auction was already finished before it began. By 6:30, the heat had settled over the red clay hills with the kind of weight that doesn't lift, that presses into your clothes and your hair and the back of your neck and stays there like a hand holding you down. The sky was white, not clouded, white, the particular colorless blaze of a Georgia July when the sun has burned through everything above it and there is nothing left between you and the full force of the day. Corbin Whitfield pulled his truck up to the farmhouse at 8:15. He had washed it, which was unusual for Corbin. He had put on a clean shirt, also unusual. He had the careful, deliberate appearance of a man who understands that today matters and has dressed accordingly, not for vanity, but for respect, the way you dress for a funeral, even when the person being buried wouldn't have cared what you wore. Emmett came down the porch steps with his jaw set. Waverly followed, phone in her hand, checking it, then putting it away, then checking it again. Marlowe came last. She had the record book under one arm and the red folding chair under the other. Waverly looked at the chair. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say about whether Marlowe was coming. That argument had been settled on the porch 3 weeks ago, and Waverly had learned from her father, if nothing else, that reopening a closed decision was a waste of energy better spent elsewhere. They climbed into Corbin's truck. Emmett rode shotgun, Waverly and Marlowe in the back seat. The signed auction notice lay in the glove compartment, but nobody opened it. They all knew what it said. Corbin drove slowly down the farm road past the hay ground on the south side, past the peach rows heavy with fruit that should have been full of pickers in 2 more weeks. Should have been if the next 4 hours went differently than the letter promised. Halfway to the auction field, Corbin spoke. He had been quiet since he picked them up, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes on the road, and when he finally said something, his voice had the quality of a man who has been thinking about a single thing for a long time and has decided that now is the moment to say it. Emmett, I keep thinking about that clause I showed you the day you signed, the one about calling the loan if the collateral loses value. He paused. The frost killed 70% of the bearing crop. That's exactly what that clause was written for. They didn't need to wait for you to miss a payment. They had grounds to call the whole note before you ever fell behind. The truck cab was quiet. Emmett looked straight ahead. I remember, he said. So why did they wait, Corbin said. Why let you miss 2 payments and then send an auction notice when they could have acted months earlier? Nobody answered, but Marlowe in the back seat opened her record book and wrote down what Corbin had said. Not the legal reasoning. She had already recorded the clause weeks ago. She wrote the question, why did they wait? She didn't have the answer yet, but she had learned across 9 summers and 8 notebooks that the right question was more valuable than a wrong answer, and that some questions carried their own kind of light illuminating things you hadn't known were in the dark. The auction field was behind the barn, a flat stretch of cut grass where Emmett usually parked the hay equipment in August. Today it held a white canvas tent, the kind used for outdoor weddings and church picnics, stretched over a folding table with a microphone stand and a row of metal chairs. A banner hung from the tent's center pole. Ridgeline Auction Group, licensed auctioneer Reed Prescott. About 30 people stood or sat in the heat. Neighboring farmers in work clothes, their faces weathered and watchful. A few men in pressed shirts and clean boots who had the look of farm investors, people who bought land, not to work it, but to hold it, and who attended auctions the way other men attended car shows scanning for value. Several women from the community, some of whom had known Emmett for decades, standing in a loose group near the fence, with the particular quiet solidarity of people who have come to witness something they cannot stop. And in the middle of it all, behind the folding table, a man Marlowe had never seen before. Reed Prescott was about 45. He had the polished, efficient manner of a man who conducted transactions for a living, whose comfort in a room came not from the relationships in it, but from the procedures he controlled. He moved through the pre-auction setup with brisk confidence, adjusting the microphone, shuffling papers, checking the registration sheet. He wore a blue sport coat despite the heat, and his hair was combed back with the kind of precision that suggested he had looked in a mirror before leaving the house and had been satisfied with what he saw. Marlowe set up her red folding chair at the back of the crowd. She placed the record book on her knee. She uncapped her pen. She wrote the time, 10:02 in the morning. She wrote the name on the banner, Ridgeline Auction Group, Reed Prescott, licensed auctioneer. She counted the registered bidders on the sheet posted on the tent pole, 14 names. She photographed the sheet with her mother's phone, holding it steady, framing the whole list. Then she read the list. The first name on the buyer registration, Copper Ridge Partners, LLC. She stopped writing. She looked at what she had just written. Then she flipped back 6 pages in her record book to the entry from 2 weeks ago, the one she'd made at the kitchen table after searching the Georgia Business Registry. Reed Prescott. 3 business entities. Copper Ridge Partners, LLC. She looked at both entries. The same name on 2 different pages, written on 2 different days for 2 different reasons, and now connected by a single piece of paper pinned to a tent pole in a field where her grandfather's life was about to be sold. She took the phone out again and opened the Georgia Business Registry page she'd bookmarked. She searched for Copper Ridge Partners, LLC. The page loaded slowly on the weak rural signal, the loading bar crawling across the screen, while the heat pressed down and the crowd murmured, and Reed Prescott tapped the microphone twice. The page loaded. Registered agent Reed Prescott. Ownership multiple members. Reed Prescott, 22% ownership stake. Marlowe looked up from the phone screen. She looked at Reed Prescott standing at the auction table preparing to sell her grandfather's farm. She looked at the phone screen showing Reed Prescott as a registered owner of the company listed to buy it. He was the auctioneer. He was also at 22% a partial owner of the company registered as the buyer. She looked down at her record book. She had been keeping notebooks for 3 years. She had filled one after another with observations she didn't always understand immediately. She understood this one. She understood it the way you understand a door slamming shut, completely immediately and with the full awareness that something has just changed. Then she saw something else. Rowan Gentry was at the auction. The loan officer from Blue Valley. He was standing beside Reed Prescott at the folding table, and they were talking in the easy, familiar way of men who know each other well, not the careful, professional exchange of two people meeting at a business function. Rowan put his hand on Reed's shoulder. Reed nodded and smiled. It was the body language of friendship, of partnership, of two men who were in a way that neither of them intended to be visible on the same side of the table. Marlowe wrote in her notebook, Rowan Gentry and Reed Prescott, they know each other, not business meeting friendly, friends. She underlined the last word. She had been sitting in the red folding chair for 11 minutes. She had filled 2 pages, and she had in her hands in the notebook and on the phone screen something that nobody else in that field had bothered to look for. Wyatt Fairchild was standing by the fence at the edge of the tent, leaning against a post with his arms crossed, watching the setup with the flat, bitter expression of someone who has seen this before. He noticed Marlowe in the back row. He walked over. He crouched beside her chair and spoke in a low voice, the words coming fast-edged with something that was not quite anger and not quite fear. "That guy," Wyatt said, tilting his head toward the auction table. "He ran my dad's auction, too." Marlowe looked at him. "You're sure? I sat right where you're sitting. Same table, same microphone, same guy running the whole thing. I was 13. I remember his face." Marlowe wrote it down. Wyatt watched her write and shook his head slightly, the way you shake your head at something you don't understand and have stopped trying to. "So what are you going to do?" he said. "Write a few more lines." Marlowe closed the notebook. She didn't answer. She looked at her mother standing 15 feet away, at the edge of the crowd with her arms crossed and her face held in the careful stillness of a woman holding herself together through an act of will. She looked at Emmett sitting in a folding chair near the front, his back straight, his hands on his knees, his face composed in the expression of a man who has decided to endure something and will not look away from it while it happens. She looked at Reed Prescott at the microphone. She thought about Wyatt's father, Hollis Fairchild, a man she had never met sitting in a chair like this one in a field like this one, watching the same man at the same table holding the same hope that something might stop what was happening. And nothing had stopped it, and the farm was gone. And Wyatt was 14 years old and hauling hay on someone else's land. Marlowe made a decision. It was not a dramatic decision. It didn't feel large in the moment of making it. It felt like the natural next step, the way the next entry in a record book always feels like the natural next step from the last one. It felt like the thing you do when you've been paying attention and the attention has led you somewhere and you realize that the only thing left to do is stand up. She stood up from her red folding chair. She picked up her record book. She walked to the front of the crowd. Reed Prescott had just called the auction to order. He had his auctioneer's voice on the rhythmic, professional cadence that carries across a tent and holds a crowd's attention. He was mid-sentence when Marlowe reached the table. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a scene of it. She simply walked to the table and stood there with her composition notebook open to the relevant pages, the way you stand at a counter when you have something to present and you are prepared to wait until someone acknowledges you. Reed Prescott looked down at her. The crowd noticed the girl at the auction table in the way crowds notice unexpected things. A gradual rippling reorientation, a shifting of attention from the front of the tent to the small figure standing at its center with a notebook and a phone. "Auction's beginning," Reed said. His voice was pleasant enough, the voice of a man handling a minor disruption. "You need to step back, sweetheart." "I have a question first," Marlowe said. Her voice was clear and even, not loud, not aggressive, the voice of someone who has something specific to say and has already decided that she is going to say it regardless of what comes next. It was the voice of a person who has practiced paying attention for 3 years and has never once practiced raising her voice because she has never needed to. Precision is quieter than volume and it cuts deeper. Reed Prescott looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. He had expected a child's interruption, a lost girl, a nervous grandchild, something to be managed with a smile and a gentle redirect. What he was looking at was not that. "This is an adult proceeding," he said. "I know," Marlowe said. "My grandfather is the farm owner. I'm allowed to be present." A beat. The tent was listening now. 30 people in the July heat, their attention focused on the table where a man in a blue sport coat was being addressed by a girl with a notebook. "What's your question?" he said. Marlowe opened the record book. She set it on the table. She pointed to the entry she had made 20 minutes ago. Reed Prescott, Copper Ridge Partners, LLC, 22% ownership stake. Then she laid her mother's phone beside the notebook open to the Georgia Business Registry page, the screen showing Reed Prescott as registered agent and partial owner of Copper Ridge Partners, LLC. The phone screen sat on the table next to the bidder registration sheet that listed Copper Ridge Partners, LLC as the first registered buyer. The notebook, the phone, the registration sheet, 3 documents on a folding table under a white canvas tent, arranged by a 12-year-old girl with the calm, methodical precision of someone who has been organizing information on paper since she was 9 years old, and who understands instinctively that evidence is most powerful when it is allowed to speak for itself. "You're running the auction," Marlowe said, "and your company is also registered to buy the farm." The tent was very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight, the kind that presses in from every direction and makes the air feel thicker, denser, harder to breathe. 30 people standing in it, not one of them moving. "My question," Marlowe said in the same clear, even voice, "is whether that's allowed." Reed Prescott's expression went through several things very quickly. First, the automatic dismissal, the reflex of a man encountering an obstacle he expects to be minor. Then something sharper, the recalculation of a man who has looked at what's on the table and understood that the girl has not made a mistake. Then something that was not quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood, the particular quality of attention that belongs to a person who has just realized that the room they are standing in is not the room they thought it was. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the phone screen. He looked at Marlowe. "That's a separate business entity," he said carefully. "There's no conflict." "My daughter asked you a question." Waverly's voice came from behind Marlowe, steady, quiet, carrying the particular authority of a mother who has just heard someone try to explain something to her child that is not true, and who has decided in the space of a single breath that she is done watching. Waverly had her own phone out. She had been listening, and in the 3 minutes since Marlowe had walked to the table, she had sent a text message to Tessa Stanhope, the real property attorney in Rome she'd arranged that morning. Tessa Stanhope was already calling back. Waverly stepped forward. She took the call. She pressed the speaker button. The crowd watched. A woman holding a phone on speaker in the middle of a farm auction, a girl with a composition notebook standing at the auctioneer's table, and Reed Prescott, for the first time since he had set up the tent that morning, standing still. Then Rowan Gentry moved. He had been standing to the side of the table during Marlowe's question, and his face had gone through its own sequence, faster and less controlled than Reed's. He stepped forward now, positioning himself at the table with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to managing difficult conversations, and spoke in a voice that was still professional, still measured, still wearing the mask of institutional authority. "This is a matter between the seller and the auction firm," Rowan said. "The bank has no involvement in the auction company's ownership structure. The auction should proceed." Tessa Stanhope's voice came through the speaker, clear, precise, the voice of an attorney who bills by the hour and does not waste words. Could you identify yourself, please? Rowan Gentry, Blue Valley Agricultural Credit. I'm the loan officer on this account. Mr. Gentry, were you aware of the ownership relationship between Reed Prescott and Copper Ridge Partners prior to today's auction? Silence. The kind of silence that answers a question more honestly than any words could. Rowan Gentry stood at the table with his mouth slightly open, the professional mask flickering, the calculation visible behind his eyes. I'm not involved in the selection of the auction firm, he said. That's not what I asked, Tessa Stanhope said. Longer silence. Rowan did not answer. He stood there in the white heat under the canvas tent, and his silence spread outward through the crowd. The farmers understood it. The investors understood it. Even the women by the fence who had come only to witness understood it. A man had been asked a direct question and had chosen not to answer, and in the mathematics of honesty, refusal is its own kind of confession. Tessa Stanhope continued. She cited the relevant section of Georgia's auction law governing agency disclosure in foreclosure proceedings. The statute required complete disclosure of any financial interest held by the auctioneer in any potential purchaser prior to the commencement of bidding. It designated such undisclosed dual agency as grounds for immediate mandatory suspension of proceedings pending review. Reed Prescott had not made the required disclosure. The composition notebook and the phone screen documented that he had not. The bidder registration sheet confirmed that Copper Ridge Partners was listed as a buyer, and Tessa Stanhope on speakerphone in a field in northwest Georgia laid out the legal consequence of those facts with the methodical clarity of a woman who has read the statute before and knows exactly where the weight falls. Reed Prescott looked at the notebook on the table. He looked at the phone screen. He looked at Rowan Gentry, who was no longer looking at him. He made a decision, the visible kind, the kind you can see forming in a person's face, the way you can see weather forming on the horizon, dark and inevitable and arriving whether you want it to or not. He stepped back from the microphone. We're going to pause the proceedings, he said. The tent exhaled, not with relief, not yet, with the particular stunned stillness of a group of people who have just watched something happen that none of them expected, and all of them are still processing. A few of the farmers exchanged glances. One of the women by the fence put her hand over her mouth. Reed Prescott began gathering his papers. He moved quickly, mechanically stuffing documents into a leather portfolio with none of the brisk efficiency he'd shown 20 minutes earlier. Rowan Gentry was already walking toward the parking area, phone to his ear, his voice low and taut. Marlowe stood close enough to hear 3 words before he moved out of range. We have a problem. She wrote them down. She wrote the time, 10:47 in the morning. Corbin Whitfield had been standing by his truck through the entire confrontation, both hands resting on the truck bed, watching the tent from 60 feet away. His face showed nothing, but when Marlowe looked at him across the field, she saw that his eyes were wet. Not crying, just wet. The way a man's eyes get when he has been holding something for a very long time, and the thing he has been holding has just unexpectedly become lighter. And beside Corbin at the fence line, Wyatt Fairchild stood with both fists wrapped around the top rail, his knuckles white, his face carrying the expression of a boy watching something he had believed was impossible happening in front of him. His father had sat in a chair in a field like this one. His father had watched the same man at the same table, and nothing had stopped it. And now something had. And the something was a composition notebook and a girl who used it. Waverly finished her call with Tessa Stanhope. She turned to her father, who was still sitting in his folding chair near the front of the tent, his back straight, his hands on his knees, looking out at the field where the crowd was beginning to disperse into the heat. The auction's been suspended, Dad, Waverly said. They can't proceed today. Emmett looked at his daughter. Then he looked at his granddaughter, who was standing beside Waverly with the red folding chair under one arm and the composition notebook under the other, her face flushed from the heat, but otherwise composed in the manner of someone who has done what needed doing and is now waiting to find out if it was enough. Emmett reached out and put his hand on Marlowe's shoulder. He didn't say anything for a moment. His hand was heavy, warm, calloused from 60 years of work, and it rested on her shoulder with the weight of everything he could not say and did not need to. "You brought your chair," he said. "I said I would stay," Marlowe said. "I know you did," Emmett said. He kept his hand on her shoulder. He looked out at the farm, the peach rows, the hay ground, the timber ridge on the north boundary, the barn where the old equipment sat, the farmhouse porch where he drank his morning coffee in the particular silence of a man who is at peace with where he is. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at his granddaughter with an expression that Waverly would describe later to her husband, to her mother's friends, to anyone who asked about the day, as the look of a man who has just understood something that has been true his whole life and has never needed a word before now. They stood there in the shade of Corbin's truck, the three of them in the field behind the barn, where the white tent was already being taken down by men who no longer had a reason to be there. The peach trees stood in their rows beyond the fence, heavy with fruit, 2 weeks from harvest, still there, still growing, still waiting for the hands that had tended them for 40 years to come back and finish the work. And in the parking area, Rowan Gentry sat in his car with the engine running, his phone pressed to his ear, talking fast, talking low, and the air conditioning blowing through the vents could not cool the particular kind of heat that was building on the other end of the line. The heat of questions that would need to be answered, of records that would need to be explained, of a phone screen and a notebook and a 12-year-old girl who had done nothing more complicated than write down what she saw and then stand up and show it to a room full of people who had not thought to look. What followed was not fast. It was not the kind of resolution that arrives in a single afternoon with a handshake and a villain in handcuffs and music swelling over the closing shot. Real justice, the kind that happens in county offices and conference calls and stacks of notarized documents, moves at the speed of paperwork. It grinds, it stalls. It requires a particular kind of endurance that is different from the endurance required to stand up in a tent and ask a question, but no less demanding. The auction tent came down that Tuesday afternoon. Two men from Ridgeline Auction Group folded the canvas and loaded the table and the microphone stand into a white van and drove away without speaking to anyone. By 3 o'clock, the field behind the barn was empty, the cut grass flattened where the chairs had been, and the only evidence that anything had happened there was a rectangle of yellowed earth where the tent had blocked the sun. Emmett stood on the porch and watched them go. He held his coffee cup in both hands, though the coffee had gone cold an hour ago, and he watched the white van turn onto the county road and disappear behind the tree line. He did not say anything. He did not need to. His posture said it, the slight forward lean of a man watching a threat retreat and not yet believing it is gone. At 4:17 that afternoon, a black sedan turned off the county road and came up the farm's gravel drive. Marlowe was sitting on the porch step with her record book. She heard the tires on gravel before she saw the car, and she wrote the time and a description of the vehicle before it had reached the house. Black sedan, not a truck, not a farm vehicle, a town car. She wrote someone from the bank. She was right. Dorian Forsythe stepped out of the sedan the way a man steps into a room he intends to control. He was about 55, broad across the chest, with silver hair combed back and a blue tie loosened at the throat in concession to the heat. He was the branch vice president of Blue Valley Agricultural Credit, Rowan Gentry's superior, the man who signed the letters that Rowan delivered. He had not called ahead. He had not sent a letter. He had driven 40 minutes from the Rome office on a Tuesday afternoon in July because what had happened that morning required a particular kind of response, the in-person kind, the kind that carries the implicit message that this is serious enough for a man in a tie to leave his air-conditioned office and stand in your yard. Emmett came down the steps. Waverly stood in the doorway. Corbin Whitfield, who had stayed at the farm after the auction because leaving did not feel right, sat in the porch swing and did not get up. "Mr. Bancroft," Dorian said. He extended his hand. Emmett looked at it. He shook it because Emmett was a man who shook hands even when he didn't want to, because his mother had taught him that courtesy was not something you withdrew from people who didn't deserve it. Dorian spoke for 6 minutes. Marlowe timed it. He used the word regrettable twice and the word misunderstanding 3 times and the phrase move forward constructively once. He said that the disruption at the auction was unfortunate and that Blue Valley valued its relationship with the Bancroft family and that there were, he was certain ways to resolve the situation that would be satisfactory to all parties. Then he produced a document from the inside pocket of his jacket. 2 pages printed with a signature line at the bottom. "This is a mutual resolution agreement," he said. "It states that both parties consider the matter closed. In exchange, Blue Valley will extend your loan term by 6 months. No penalties, no auction, clean slate." He held the document out to Emmett. Emmett reached for it. "Dad, don't sign anything." Waverly's voice from the doorway, not loud, but carrying the same quiet surgical certainty that Marlowe's voice had carried at the auction table that morning. Emmett's hands stopped in the air between himself and the document. Dorian turned to look at Waverly. Then his gaze moved past her to the porch steps where Marlowe sat with the record book open on her knees writing. "What's she writing?" Dorian asked. Marlowe looked up at him. She met his eyes with the same steady, unblinking attention she had given Reed Prescott 4 hours earlier. She held the pen above the page. "Everything," she said. The word sat in the air between them. Dorian looked at the notebook. He looked at the pen. He looked at the girl, and something shifted in his expression, a recalibration finer and more controlled than Reed Prescott's had been, but recognizable as the same essential process. The process of a man reassessing how much trouble he is standing in. He turned back to Emmett. "I'd encourage you to think carefully, Mr. Bancroft. The bank's goodwill doesn't last forever." "Neither does mine," Emmett said. Dorian stood in the yard for a moment longer. Then he folded the document, put it back in his jacket, returned to his sedan, and drove away. The gravel settled. The dust hung in the air above the drive and then dissipated in the heat. Corbin Whitfield, still sitting in the porch swing, spoke for the first time since the car had arrived. "They're scared, Emmett." Emmett turned to look at him. "If they weren't scared, they wouldn't have come here this afternoon. They'd wait. They'd let the lawyers handle it next week, next month. The fact that a vice president drove out here 4 hours after the auction means they know what Marlowe found won't stop at one suspended proceeding." Corbin rocked the porch swing gently with one foot. He looked out at the peach rows. "Don't sign anything. Call the lawyer." Waverly had already called Tessa Stanhope from the kitchen. She was on the phone before Dorian's sedan reached the county road. The investigation took 4 months. I want to tell you about those 4 months, not as a summary of legal procedure, but as an experience lived by the people inside it, because that is the part the documents don't capture and the part that matters most. The formal complaint was filed in August by Tessa Stanhope on behalf of Emmett Bancroft with the Georgia Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. It was accompanied by documentation that Marlowe had assembled in her composition notebook and on her mother's phone. Photographs of the bidder registration sheet, screenshots of the Georgia Business Registry, showing Reed Prescott as registered agent and 22% owner of Copper Ridge Partners, LLC. Handwritten entries recording dates, names, observations. The record book of a 12-year-old girl submitted as evidence in a state consumer protection proceeding, and it was, Tessa Stanhope would say later, the most organized supporting documentation she had ever received from a client. Marlowe went back to Cartersville at the end of August to start 7th grade. She called Emmett every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock. The calls lasted between 4 and 11 minutes, depending on whether Emmett was in a talking mood or a listening mood, and Marlowe had learned to read the difference in the first 3 seconds from the way he said hello. "Any news, Grandpa?" "Trees are still here. That's news enough." His voice was tired. Not the tiredness of physical labor which Emmett had carried his whole life without complaint, but a different kind. The tiredness of waiting, of having something unresolved pressing against the edges of every ordinary day, the way a stone in your boot presses against your foot with every step. You can still walk, you can still work, but you feel it constantly, and the feeling takes something out of you that rest alone does not replenish. In September, an investigator from the Attorney General's office contacted Emmett to take his deposition. He drove to Rome with Waverly and sat in a conference room on the 3rd floor of a government building and answered questions for 2.5 hours. He had to describe the loan application, the payments, the frost, the missed installments, the letter, the auction. He had to lay his financial life open on a table in front of a woman with a recorder and a legal pad, every dollar and every shortfall and every decision he had made in 4 years of trying to keep a farm alive after the weather took 70% of his income in a single April night. When they walked out of the building into the September sun, Emmett stopped on the sidewalk. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and looked up at the sky, which was blue and clean and entirely indifferent to what had just happened inside. "I've been farming 60 years, he said. "Never had to explain myself to a stranger in a suit before today." Waverly took his arm. "You're not explaining yourself, Dad. You're explaining what they did to you." Emmett looked at his daughter. He didn't answer, but he let her hold his arm as they walked to the car, and that was its own kind of answer. In late September, Tessa Stanhope called Waverly with news. The investigation had uncovered a financial arrangement between Reed Prescott and Rowan Gentry that neither man had disclosed: a referral fee. When Rowan identified a loan account that was in default or approaching default and referred it to Ridgeline Auction Group for auction, Reed Prescott paid Rowan a fee for the referral. The fee was not large, a few $1,000s per transaction, but it was consistent and it was hidden, and it meant that Rowan Gentry had a personal financial incentive to push struggling farm loans toward auction, rather than toward restructuring workout or any of the other options that a loan officer acting in good faith might have explored. Rowan had not disclosed this arrangement to Blue Valley's Compliance Oversight Board. He had not disclosed it to Emmett. He had not disclosed it to anyone until investigators found the payments in Reed Prescott's business records and traced them back to an account that Rowan had opened at a bank in Dalton, 40 miles from Rome, under a name that was technically his, but that none of his colleagues at Blue Valley had ever heard him use. Waverly called Marlowe after hanging up with Tessa. She told her what the investigation had found. Marlowe listened in silence. Then she said, "So it wasn't just Grandpa?" "No," Waverly said, "it wasn't. The Fairchild farm, the Birch farm, Rowan sent them all to Reed." "That's what it looks like." Marlowe was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Lennox knew. She didn't have the names, but she knew." There was something in Marlowe's voice that Waverly hadn't heard before. Not triumph, not anger. Something quieter and more complicated. The sound of a child absorbing the knowledge that a system designed to help people had been turned deliberately and for profit into a mechanism for taking from them. It was the sound of innocence encountering corruption, not for the first time, because Marlowe had never been naive, but encountering it at a depth that she hadn't known was possible. She had known that the auction was wrong. She had suspected a connection. But the referral fees, the hidden account, the deliberate, repeated, methodical extraction of land from families who trusted the man sitting across the desk, that was something different. That was not a mistake. That was architecture. Reed Prescott's auctioneer license was suspended pending a formal disciplinary hearing. Rowan Gentry was placed on administrative suspension from Blue Valley. In October, Dorian Forsythe called Tessa Stanhope. He wanted to settle. Quietly. Quickly. Without further regulatory attention. Tessa Stanhope was not interested in quiet. She told him so. "My client isn't interested in quiet, Mr. Forsythe. My client is interested in his farm." Ms. Stanhope Blue Valley is the largest agricultural lender in this region. We serve hundreds of farm families. One employee's misconduct shouldn't define an institution's reputation. If you're worried about your institution's reputation, I'd suggest you start by restructuring my client's loan on terms that reflect what your employee did to him. Dorian was silent for a long time. Tessa waited. She had learned in 20 years of real property law in rural Georgia that silence from the other side of a negotiation was not a weapon. It was a surrender that hadn't found its words yet. Blue Valley Agricultural Credit agreed to restructure Emmett's operating note. They extended the term, they adjusted the payment schedule to account for the frost-related crop loss the year that Rowan Gentry had used as leverage to push Emmett toward an auction that would have personally enriched Rowan and his partner. They waived the accumulated default penalties, every dollar of them. The farm remained in Emmett's name. The deed stayed where it had been since 1981. Emmett Bancroft owned 175 acres, the Red Clay Hills east of Rome, Georgia. The peach trees 2 weeks away from harvest on the morning of the auction were picked by the end of August. Every last one. Marlowe was there for every day of it, rising at 5:30, pulling on her boots, walking into the rows with a picking bag over her shoulder, and the morning mist still low between the trees. Wyatt Fairchild came back to help with the harvest. He worked beside Marlowe in the rows without saying much, the way he always worked, with the quiet, physical competence of a boy who had grown up doing this. They picked for 6 days. On the 7th day, the last day when the final bins were loaded and the trucks had come and gone and the trees stood empty in the late afternoon light, Wyatt and Marlowe sat under the oldest peach tree on the property, the one Emmett said Orrin had planted first, the trunk thick and scarred, the branches still heavy with leaves. Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry I said that thing about you just writing stuff down." Marlowe shrugged. "You were right, though. I just wrote stuff down." Wyatt laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, not a large laugh, a short, surprised sound as if the laughter had escaped before he could decide whether to let it out. "Yeah," he said, "but those were different lines." They sat there under the tree for a while longer. The light was changing the way it changes in late August in Georgia, softening from white to gold, the shadows lengthening across the orchard. Wyatt picked up a fallen peach from the ground and turned it over in his hands. "My dad never talks about losing our place," he said. "Not to me, not to my mom, not to anyone. But last week he asked me about your grandpa's auction, asked me what happened. I told him about you, about the notebook." Marlowe waited. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after I told him. Didn't say anything. Then he said somebody should have been paying attention at ours too. Wyatt set the peach down on the ground between them. I think that was the first time he ever said anything about it out loud. Marlowe didn't write this conversation in her record book. Some things she kept in a different place, not on paper, somewhere closer. Marlowe Bancroft is 15 now. She is in ninth grade. She has kept a composition notebook every year since she was 9 years old, and she is on her 14th volume. She doesn't write as much about the farm anymore. She writes about other things now, too. The wider world beyond the red clay hills, the patterns she notices in the way institutions work and the way people navigate them. She reads the local paper. She follows county commission meetings. She has started keeping a separate notebook for questions she wants to investigate, later questions about zoning laws and water rights and agricultural subsidies and all the invisible structures that determine who gets to keep what they have and who doesn't. But she still spends summers on Emmett's farm. She still brings her red folding chair. She still knows which peach rose smells sweetest in late July and what the old hay equipment sounds like when it's running right, and the particular sound of Emmett's coffee cup being set down on the porch railing in the early morning when the birds are just starting and the day is still something to look forward to. Emmett is 77 now. He farms more slowly than he used to. He lets Marlowe and Waverly and Corbin do more of the heavy work. He sits on the porch more. He watches the peach rose in the morning light with the patient, satisfied attention of a man who has seen enough seasons to know that a farm's survival is not a single event, but an accumulation of survived moments, frosts and auctions and bad years and unexpected debts. And one summer when a 12-year-old girl brought a red folding chair to a field and wrote down what she saw. He has never mentioned that morning to Marlowe directly, not because it doesn't matter, because with Emmett, the things that matter most are the ones he carries in silence and shows through presence, not speech. He watches Marlowe the way he watches the peach rose in the morning, with the steady, weathered appreciation of a man who knows what he's looking at and is grateful every morning that it is still there. The record book from that summer, the 8th composition notebook, sits on the shelf above Marlowe's desk in her bedroom in Cartersville. It is the same kind she has always used. She keeps it between volumes 7 and 9 in order because Marlowe is the kind of person who keeps things in order. On the last page in the bottom margin, there is a line written in handwriting that is not hers. Larger, rougher, leaning to the right. Wyatt Fairchild wrote it at the end of that August when Marlowe handed him the notebook and asked if he wanted to add anything. He wrote, "She just wrote stuff down. That's it. That's the whole thing." Marlowe never erased it. She liked that someone else had understood. And earlier in that notebook, on a page dated 3 weeks before the auction, there is the entry that changed everything. Written in Marlowe's careful, deliberate hand, the handwriting she had been developing since she was 9 years old, the handwriting of a girl who had decided that the world was worth documenting and had never once reconsidered. Reed Prescott, Ridgeline Auction Group, Copper Ridge Partners, LLC. Reed Prescott, 22% owner. Same person. Why? The word why is underlined twice. Not because she knew the answer when she wrote it, because she had learned across 7.5 notebooks before this one that the questions worth asking are the ones that feel urgent before you can explain why. That the act of writing the question is itself the beginning of the answer. That a girl sitting on a farmhouse porch with a pen and a notebook and the willingness to look carefully at the world around her is not a small thing. Even when the world around her is vast and complicated and full of people who assume that a 12-year-old has nothing to contribute. I want to tell you what I think this story is really about. Not the auction statute, not the dual agency violation, not Reed Prescott's license suspension, or Rowan Gentry's administrative leave, or the referral fees, or the hidden bank account in Dalton, or the operating notes restructuring. Those are the consequences. They are important. They are the machinery of accountability. And they matter because without them, The next farm and the next family and the next Emmett Bancroft would have been fed into the same machine and ground down the same way. But they are not what the story's about. What the story's about is a 9-year-old girl who sat on the floor of a library one winter afternoon and read that the good writers write things down, and who decided with the complete and uncomplicated conviction of a child who has not yet learned to doubt her own instincts that this was the kind of person she wanted to be, and who kept that decision through 7.5 notebooks before the one that mattered, through summers of peach harvests and hay bales and porch mornings and all the ordinary unrecorded moments that accumulate into a life spent paying attention. She wasn't looking for fraud when she wrote Reed Prescott's name in her notebook 3 weeks before the auction. She was just writing down what she noticed, the way she always did, the way she had trained herself to do since she was 9 years old. Because she had read that the good writers write things down, and she had decided that this was true. It turned out it was also the kind of habit that saves farms, not because she planned to save one, not because she set out that summer with the intention of uncovering a scheme, but because paying attention, real attention, the kind you commit to paper, the kind you build into a practice before you know what it's for, is not a neutral act. It changes what you are able to see, and what you are able to see changes what you are able to do. Marlowe Bancroft saw what nobody else in that field had bothered to look for. She wrote it down, she stood up, and the peach trees were still there in August, and they were still there the August after that, and they are still there now, growing in long, fragrant rows in the red clay hills east of Rome, Georgia, on 175 acres that belong to a man named Emmett Bancroft, who sits on his porch every morning with a cup of coffee and watches the light come up over the orchard and knows in the quiet way that he knows all the most important things, that the farm is still his and that it is still his, because a girl brought a chair to a field and opened a notebook and wrote down what she saw. And that, I think, is what a record book is for.